Welcome to the Power Trends podcast, produced by the New York Independent System Operator, where we discuss energy planning, public policy, and other issues affecting New York's power grid.
Hello and welcome to the Power Trends podcast by the New York Independent System Operator. My name is Kevin Lanahan, your host, and I'm joined today by Udayan Nair, the Director of Grid Transition for the New York Independent System Operator. Udayan joined us just over a year ago. So congratulations, you made it through the first year of your tenure here. We want to talk about with Udayan is his role and the group that Udayan is overseeing for the Independent System Operator. The goals and the very serious and significant change adding this role. But first, let's talk about you. You come to us from Canada. Were you born and raised in Ottawa, Ontario area?
Well, I actually was very fortunate. My dad was a diplomat for the Indian government, so that really gave me the opportunity to travel across the world. I was born in India. After that, my dad's work took us to Pakistan. Then we moved to Chicago for 3 years, came back to India, went to a small country called Bhutan, which is hard to find on the map.
Amazing.
Went to Hong Kong after that. My dad got posted to Sri Lanka, and I decided to pursue my higher education in Canada. And that's where I've been for the last 22 years before I decided to pursue this fantastic opportunity here at the NYISO.
So you have an undergraduate degree from the University of Windsor in Ontario, and then on to get your MBA not too far from there at the University of Waterloo?
I did my master's in engineering at the University of Waterloo and my MBA from the University of Toronto.
Got it. Excellent. And then career experience, what were some of the roles that you held in, because you've got a couple decades of experience in the energy industry. Walk us through those positions in the companies.
My foray into the utility space was, I would say, a little bit accidental or coincidental. Most of the graduates that went to the University of Windsor in the electrical program went into the automotive sector. Windsor's the automotive capital of Canada. I had this fantastic opportunity to join Hydro One, which is Ontario's largest transmission owner. And it was a great vantage point. I joined their operations division. From there, I was able to work with a number of different participants in the sector. And then it really helped me understand and appreciate all the things that have to happen perfectly such that, when you turn on that light switch, the power comes on. And that really made me want to pursue a career in the utility space. I then decided to take my fortunes out west. I went to Alberta. I joined the system operator over there, and they were really going through a push on integrating new wind resources. And that was one of the things I helped in facilitating. And while I was there, I said, you know what, why not take my career in a slightly different trajectory? So I joined power trading, and I did that for all of a year. It was exciting, but I found my engineering roots calling me back to Ontario. So I went back, I joined the independent system operator where I spent 12 years. And I was there working in a number of different capacities, integrating new resources, connecting new loads, helping transition, prepare for the transition that is to come. I was helping support the control room by providing operating security limits on a 24/7 basis to ensure that the power system stayed reliable. And through that journey, the one vertical which I wanted to delve in a little bit deeper into was the generation space. And that's where I was before I joined the NYISO. I was the manager for their day-ahead and real-time energy markets teams, which operates their 16,000 megawatt portfolio on a real-time basis, essentially optimizes that. So that was a very important and interesting experience for me.
So deep experience across several different lines that make you well-suited for this role. You're focused on transmission, then you're learning about markets through the trading, and then the reliability aspects. So then you arrive here. Maybe we should start off by discussing a little bit about what the role is and specifically what some of the goals are. What was interesting about this, because it's a brand new department?
That was the most exciting piece, that it's a brand new function, very important mission. I've been reading about New York, the utility sector is a fairly small place. Understanding the ambition of New York with the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act to transition to going towards 70% of the energy supplied by renewable sources in 2030 and 100% by 2040. A change of this magnitude is going to impact all parts of the organizations. And it has to be done at a rapid pace. I found this as a perfect opportunity where I could leverage both my planning experience, my operations experience, and I put my name in the hat, hope for the best, and here I am.
When we think about, like you said, the incredible amount of change that has to happen in this short window, It could also feel a little daunting. What are your perspectives about how we're going to reach these goals and how the ISO can be effective and productive in trying to transition the system?
It's going to require the collaboration of the entire sector to be successful in this mission. So let's start by speaking to some of the factors that are changing in this space. And maybe we start with demand. Demand is going to radically change over the next few years.
We're already seeing it step up.
Absolutely. And that's only going to be amplified as we move into this future. And what are the reasons for it? Well, we're looking at reshoring a lot of the manufacturing, a lot of the critical infrastructure that's going to be coming back. And so that's really driving large load growth. So we're getting chip fabs coming back. At the same time, we look at how much time we spend on the internet, the types of media that we're consuming. That requires data centers to help power the future. That is also driving significant amounts of load growth. We look at EVs, electric vehicles. They're going to be increasing in volume, and that's going to increase the energy demands. And then on top of that, especially in the Northeast, we're migrating the demand mix away from fossil fuel resources to heat our homes towards heat pumps. So that's going to be a significant driver of demand in the wintertime.
Especially in the Northeast, you come from Canada, you know how cold it can be.
Absolutely. So that's significantly impacting our demand profile. At the same time, what we're seeing is there's a paradigm shift in what we're trying to do on the supply side, where a lot of the fossil resources are of a certain vintage, they're retiring. On top of that, there's policy decisions which also limit their operation. And so those resources, as they retire, they're being replaced by new intermittent resources, primarily wind resources, solar resources. If you look at our interconnection queue, batteries are also going to form a large part of that resource mix. And they have different performance characteristics, different dynamics on the system. When you pair those two factors together, you're going to see a changing supply mix, an increased demand mix, and we have to be prepared for that future. If I could add in a third variable into this piece, which is extreme weather, that is becoming more frequent, it's becoming more pronounced, and we've seen the impacts of that. In California, there was flooding. We look back a few years ago, the winter storms in Texas severely impaired the power system operations, and we've seen those occurrences become more frequent. So we have to be planning and incorporating the best practices to be ready for this reality. Changes in demand, changes in supply, and planning for these extreme weather events.
And just earlier this week, we saw some high temperatures in Texas and some verging on consumer appeals in April. In one way, the advent of this group and your role is to bridge between the planning function and operations. What does that look like in practice?
So with regards to bringing those groups together, they always had great working relationships, but really the need to converge these working relationships to be even stronger. So the magnitude of change is pretty significant. And some of the portfolios under the grid transition team, we're looking at demand forecasting. That's a key piece of our portfolio. We're looking at operating security and energy assessments, environmental attributes, environmental policies, how they are driving these decisions, what are their impacts going to be, and what are their effects on reliability. We've recently stood up a special studies group, which is going to examine the changing portfolio of generation resources. And we're aware of events that have occurred. In Texas, there's been a few instances where you have large amounts of inverter-based resources, which for certain reasons, whether it was incorrect protection settings, equipment limitations, they tripped off, and they can cause reliability risks on the power system. So as we move to this clean energy future, and we're going to be incorporating more of these resources, those are some of the missions on our team to ensure that we do so in a reliable fashion, because electricity, as it is a critical piece of our current day lifestyle, it's going to be even more important in the future.
You're trying to at once anticipate what the system will look like in the years ahead and study for that to make sure that the reliability attributes at once are there and then not negatively impacted. Does that sort of sound like the sweet spot of that?
Absolutely. And I think a very important piece in this journey is defining what are those reliability attributes. So currently, our system heavily relies on fossil fuel resources, synchronous machines, which provide a lot of reliability attributes, just as the function of the type of resources they are. The new resources that are coming onto the system have very different attributes. So the first piece is defining what are those attributes and what are the attributes that are critical for reliability. To speak to some of them, when we talk about having resources that can quickly start and come online, that have a dependable fuel source, those are things that are going to be very important. The resources that can cycle frequently, can come online, offline, and move from their minimum points to their high points in quick fashion. And on the technical side, there's a lot of other attributes that these resources provide, such as inertia, voltage control, dynamic stability. And all of these attributes need to be considered in their totality as we're looking at the power system.
All of those terms that you've just underscored for us, we've taken for granted up until now. And these are new considerations because of the new technologies. You mentioned inverter-based resources. They are different. The spinning metal, as some people refer to it, that technology that's powered the grid up till now. So as we transition, it's not enough to think about just connecting these new machines and these new technologies, but understanding how they're going to behave with one another on the system, but then in relation to the older technologies as we transition. Can you talk a little bit more about inverter-based resources and the things that you want to try and find out about those?
That's a great way to describe it. Characteristics of the spinning metal are very different from inverter-based technologies. Those are devices that run based on power electronics. Their fuel source is dependent on the sun and the wind. But as you migrate a large amount of these resources, you can have adverse impacts, even in the standard space. Currently, these technologies were niche technology, they were novel technology, but as they've become more mainstream and as we've had to rely on them more significantly to actually serve load, there's been a greater impetus and a greater focus on what are the things that we can do. The engineering studies are but one part of it. So again, examining what are the adverse interactions, under what situations they occur, that's something that we're further exploring. And when we look at our system, typically our system is meant to serve peak load. When does that occur? That's during the hottest days of summer when everyone's got their ACs running at full. But as we migrate to this new future, we're going to have inverter-based resources play a larger part in that portfolio mix. And some of that risk profile may expand just outside those summer periods. We might look at more risk in the winter periods as a result of load growth. We might even see when we're talking about spring and then the fall seasons, demand is typically tempered. But at the same time, you have inverter-based resources have significant output. The wind is strong, the sun is shining. So you may not have as much flexible generation online. And so now when we think what would happen if there's a wind lull or a storm front moving through, that's going to certainly challenge the dynamic. So again, forecasting that capability, what are the risks during that point in time? And having that awareness is the first piece to figuring out what should the solutions to help solve that. And so that's where we're expanding our envelope of studies to examine not just the peak summer periods, but outside of that time.
Okay, interesting. Great segue, because I wanted to ask about the forecasting aspect. So let's dig into that. Those traditional thermal fossil units, the spinning metal that we're used to running the system with, we've got loads of historic data, and we've got a lot of weather data over that same time period. Put those things together, it helps us do some forecasting. Now we've got the new technology and the new resources, and then you mentioned earlier the curveball that extreme weather provides for us. So a lot of new variables and a lot of questions to try and answer with the forecasting paradigm going forward.
An analogy that comes to mind is think of whenever you go to a bank, they always say past performance is not an indicator of the future. Well, that's certainly true in this space right now. The demand profiles are changing. Large loads are coming in. At the same time, we have offsetting impacts as a result of energy efficiency, building standards. So that's also changing the demand profile. The weather sensitivity of these loads is changing as well. So not only is the total magnitude of this resource changing or the peak times of demand, but the time at which it occurs is also shifting. I want to couple another factor which is added to the mix, which is distributed solar, which most of us think of as rooftop solar. That technology has really taken off. Their ambition as per the CLCPA is we should have 6,000 megawatts of solar resources, and a lot of that's coming on the distributed space. What that has is a tempering impact on demand. And then the other piece of it is we don't have direct line of sight to it. These are resources that are connecting to the distribution system and have the impact of modifying demand as we see it on the grid. But it's very important for us to understand what are their performance characteristics going to be, how many of these resources are out there, and again, how are they going to perform on the coldest days, and factoring all of those decisions into account to continually update our forecast and refine our forecast. That is becoming more challenging, and that's where we put a lot of focus on helping to refine those processes. When we look at it, data is the currency in today's age. We have access to so much data. How do we take that all into account to make the best operational decisions? One part is certainly upgrading our tools and our capabilities, but a very important point, probably the most important piece, is having the right people staff these functions and help leverage our capabilities. So very recently, actually, in the demand forecasting team, we've just put out a posting for a data scientist because those are the needs that we are seeing as part of the team, where you have to take all of this data, make good operational decisions and information decisions, and continue to build that capability.
I'm looking at the org chart. You just mentioned demand forecasting. You're going to add a data scientist there. Walk us through the rest of the structure and what the focus of those 4 specific areas are, if you will.
So the other 3 verticals within the team are, we have operations engineering, and this is the team that provides real-time engineering support to the control room, and they develop all our operational limits. And that's going to be a critical piece. I mentioned previously, the risk profile, we know it's in the summer, but it may expand. So the operations team is constantly conducting studies, reviewing assessments to make sure that our system is reliable for those instances.
And when you say operational limits, for the lay person out there that's listening, you mean?
The operational limits are essentially, we can think of, maybe to use an analogy of the highways, basically they're the speed limits. And how fast can you go without putting yourself at risk? And in this case, how much power can you transfer without putting the power system at risk? So this team is examining the full spectrum of operating conditions, what are the risks, and proposing limits to address those risks. We convened a new team, energy security, and that's composed of various different functions. We have 2 individuals that are environmental experts on this team. We also have a senior principal role that does fuel and energy security. We also think it's very important to get the input from the operations team to better understand. They're at the tip of the spear. They're the ones that see it first. As these changing dynamics are evolving, what are their experiences? How has operating the system become more challenging? So we have that function as part of this. And this umbrella, again, ensures that we are secure for energy, and that's really their focus. And then the 4th vertical as part of this is the special studies team. The real intention of this is to, again, augment and enhance our engineering capabilities with more penetration of these inverter-based resources. There could be conditions where the performance of these resources is not as consistent as some of the synchronous generation. Identify what those situations are, conduct the right types of studies to that, and then propose the corrective mitigating actions.
So you mentioned fuel and energy security. Can you walk us through what are these folks going to be looking at specifically? The idea of fuel energy security is something that I would maybe say has some more acute attention paid to it recently as we begin to get towards that winter peaking system. We see the fluctuations in especially cold weather, hearkening back to Winter Storm Elliott on that Christmas Eve where we saw a 55-degree swing. So what will you be looking at?
Great question. That is exactly the risk profile that this individual looks at. What are the upcoming winter conditions going to be looking like? What are the upcoming summer conditions? What does the fuel security look like? So a lot of the resources in the downstate region, especially on the coldest days, rely on that dual fuel capability. And by that, I mean the ability to burn oil. What does their inventory look like? What is their replenishment? And during the winter period, we conduct weekly surveys to better understand how much energy is available to these generators. And then we pair that with what is the anticipated demand profiles, and we look at that difference to ensure that there's sufficient energy and then there's a sufficient reliability margin. And this is really on the interaction between the gas sector and the power sector is one of the critical interdependencies. And there's a lot of focus in this space right now with the development of standards. When we see what happened, again, in certain winter storms, when the gas system is impaired, that limits the ability to generate power. And so identifying what are those critical interdependencies, that's another role this individual plays. That means we constantly and carefully are coordinating with the natural gas pipelines, understanding when are they taking outages, what are the facilities that are critical for them. So we never want to be shedding load, but if we are going to shed load, we certainly don't want to be shedding load at the facilities that supply the compression to these types of facilities. So that role incorporates all of these facets to ensure that we have energy security.
When you talk about integration studies, where we might focus some work on specific topics or functions, you are seeing this opportunity to try and integrate how all this data that we're going to try and summarize. These reports have a relationship to one another so that we can get a better view going forward.
The organization is undertaking a number of different initiatives across planning, markets, operations. And ensuring that we are successful in this journey, we have to characterize what are the residual risks that may remain. And that's done through assessments and using our data to, again, identify those possible blind spots. One other role within the energy security team is we're building out a portfolio facilitator role, which is going to encapsulate all of these issues, triage them, give us a list working with our control room team to identify the measures that we're proposing. Do they actually address the risks? Do they make the operators feel confident to be able to operate the system securely and reliably? And also to ensure, working with the training team, that all of these changes that are going to be coming into the system, that the operators have sufficient lead time to help understand what those changing dynamics look like. And so that when they experience those conditions in real time, they've seen them well ahead in advance and they feel confident and prepared to do so.
These are the folks that are actually running the system on a minute-to-minute basis, looking at loads of data in real time that's coming in and having to make these decisions to keep the system reliable. They're in a completely new paradigm that is only going to get more dynamic going forward with all of these changes. So in a way, we're trying to prepare the folks that are overseeing the system in the control room for these eventualities as well. I mean, this is a very forward-looking kind of discipline that your group is focused on.
When you look at that shift, the model that we currently have today, for the most part, is a few very large generation facilities that the control room operators have to dispatch, have to manage to serve load. The future we're moving to, we're going to have far more distributed resources. And to manage power system reliability, we're going to have to be coordinating and interacting with them and understanding what their performance characteristics are. If you've been to the control room, you see 10 to 12 to 14 screens. We have a giant video wall. The answer to help prepare the control room operators is not a few more screens. We're going to have to think about how do we present this information so that it can be actionable and that they have the right framework so that they recognize impending conditions.
So that there's no surprises.
Absolutely.
They've prepared for this anomaly that they're seeing and they're ready for it.
And to that point, tying in another piece of demand forecasting, which is currently we produce singular points. We look at what the time of day is, we look at temperatures, we say this is what we expect demand to be. The future world we move into, we're looking at enhancing those capabilities and producing probabilistic forecasts. So that's really accounting for the likelihood of events. And that's on the intermittent side, the likelihood that you're going to have very strong winds. And what would the generation profile look like in those conditions? What is the likelihood of having low winds, and what does that resource mix look like? Having that awareness available to the operators, that's very powerful because now they can understand this is what my generation mix looks like, this is the amount of reserve, and if there's actions that they need to take to help, they're well prepared and well aware of it.
You mentioned the data scientist. What's the day-to-day for this person? What are the goals there?
Demand forecasts rely on specific variables which are very important. Temperature being one of the key drivers of it, time of day, season that we're in. But as we move forward, there's going to be more factors that are going to be impacting these demand profiles. When we look at the greater proliferation of behind-the-meter solar, that has an offsetting impact on demand. And given that we don't have direct line of sight to it, what are the sources that we can use to understand how those units are going to perform? That's where the data scientist is going to review all the materials that are available publicly to find where the information gaps are, and then leverage the existing sources of information to build better and more refined models. The frequency at which we develop our models may increase in the future just because the grid is going to be undergoing dramatic changes over the next little while.
Do you see similar roles at the other ISOs? One, and then two, how do you envision working with the other control areas when you're capturing all this new data and information across fields?
With regards to the changes that are occurring on the system, this role is very unique. I haven't found really an equivalent to the other ISOs. The NYISO is leading the pack in creating this role. Actually, very recently, I was informed that ERCOT is also creating a similar role down in Texas to account for the pace and scale of change that they're seeing as well. It's about partnering with other organizations, other ISOs, which may be at different points in their journey, but they may have trialed certain techniques, certain practices, which work very well. What can we learn from those types of instances? When we look at it in the Northeast, a lot of the jurisdictions that we work closely with are also going to become winter peaking. Ontario is going to be winter peaking. New England's going to be winter peaking. I think one of the unique differences is the manner in which they're choosing to solve these problems. The resource mix in each of these jurisdictions is different. But where they're putting their incentives is a little bit different. So in Ontario, they're planning on building 4 small modular reactors, and nuclear is a big part of their solution. Here in New York, we're still exploring different types of zero emissions technologies that can help us get to this goal. But the key piece, we are all part of this big Eastern interconnection. And so what happens in our neighboring jurisdictions is very important to us, because on those hottest and coldest days, we do rely on emergency assistance from our neighbors. And we have to keep apprised of what those evolving dynamics mean for their supply margins as well.
I think some people out there would be very surprised that there are very robust ties that we have to the regions around us. And then I hear this from the engineers a lot. If you think of the system east of the Mississippi, it is all also robustly interconnected. It's like one big grid itself.
Absolutely.
It was fantastic having you here. Appreciate all the time because I know you're busy and I'm trying to stand all of this up. And we look forward to having you back here at some point. But Udayan Nair, Director of Grid Transition, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Kevin, for having me.
Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, the New York Independent System Operator, NYISO for short, is responsible for reliably managing New York's power grid and energy markets and providing independent data to policymakers and the public. For more independent info, please visit the NYISO blog at www.nyiso.com/blog.